The 1946 New Zealand general election took place on the 26th and 27th of November 1946 to elect a total of 80 MPs to the 28th session of the New Zealand Parliament. It's safe to say a lot happened between the previous election and this one. In late 1943, the war was starting to turn in favour of the Allies. Just before the last election, the Allies invaded Italy. Soon afterwards, Italy surrendered. However, the Germans still in Italy were putting up a fierce resistance, and Kiwi troops would be at the forefront of the effort to push the Germans out of Italy. In June of 1944, British, American and Canadian forces would invade France and liberate Paris soon after. They would then push towards Germany. In March 1945, after a long bloody fight, the Western Allies would reach Germany, and by the following month the British and Americans would be pushing in from the west and the Russians would be pushing in from the east. Realizing he had lost and Berlin would soon fall, Adolf Hitler would commit suicide on April 30th, 1945. On May 8th, 1945, Germany would officially surrender, bringing an end to the war in Europe. Following Germany's defeat, all eyes would shift to the Pacific, where the Japanese were still holding firm. New Zealanders would again play a big part in fighting the Japanese and pushing them back to Japan. In mid-1945, two major American victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa put the Japanese on the ropes, yet they still showed no signs of surrender. Facing a long and bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland, the new President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, who replaced Franklin D. Roosevelt after the latter passed away in early April 1945, was presented with a devastating new weapon that would end the war. Truman would give the go-ahead to use this new weapon, and on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, atomic bombs would be dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombings killed between 129,000 and 226,000, most of whom were civilians, and remain the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. Despite the devastating power of these bombs, the Japanese would not surrender. However, with the threat of further atomic bombings and the imminent invasion by the Soviet Union, Japan surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, bringing an end to the most devastating conflict in human history. Over 75 million people were killed during the war. Of those 75 million, 12,000 New Zealanders were killed. This may seem like a small number in comparison to other countries, but on a per capita basis, the country's losses were the highest in the British Empire. Approximately 1 out of every 150 New Zealanders died on war service. It must also be remembered that at this time New Zealand's population was just under 2 million, so these losses had a devastating impact on families as well as wider New Zealand society. Hailed as a successful wartime Prime Minister, Peter Fraser now had a new challenge, being an effective peacetime Prime Minister. Fraser's finest moment would be in San Francisco in 1945, where he was instrumental in the formation of the United Nations. Fraser spoke strongly against any great power veto being included in the proposed United Nations Charter. One British Foreign Office official thought Fraser was one of the few realists at large in those heady days approaching victory in the Second World War. As the years have gone by, and the inadequacies of the United Nations have become more obvious, Fraser's concerns would be proved correct. While Fraser shone on the world stage and at home, he privately was experiencing a great personal grief after the passing of his wife Janet, whom he called his soulmate, in 1945. As Kiwi servicemen and women returned home, Fraser focused his government's attention on supporting them reintegrate back into civil life. He implemented programs to provide job training and financial assistance to ensure a smooth transition for those who had sacrificed so much for their country. Additionally, Fraser worked to strengthen the social welfare system to provide ongoing support for veterans and their families. The war had helped bolster New Zealand nationalism, and New Zealand would also take a more independent role on the world stage, forming stronger partnerships with Australia and the United States, as well as being a voice for smaller nations, particularly in the Pacific. While on the surface it may seem Fraser was beloved by the returning servicemen, many held deep resentment towards him over a promise he had made to them before the last election. Realizing that many Kiwi troops fighting in the Mediterranean were exhausted, and many of them believed that their long period in action morally entitled them to leave the front. Fraser said their historic actions had earned them the right to come home and would give 6,000 men in the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force Furlough, also known as Leave, back home. This equated to about 20% of the New Zealand forces in theatre and a third of the 2nd New Zealand Division. By late 1943 there were 35,000 Grade A men at home, fit enough to go overseas but who held jobs in essential industry. The 6,000 furlough men were stunned by this situation when they returned home and insisted, in the interest of fairness, that these men had to replace those who had already done their bit in the war in Europe. No man twice before every man once became the battle cry of the furlough men. The government refused to bend to the furlough men's wishes, leading to a revolt that resulted in only 13% of the men returning to the Mediterranean. The Furlough Mutiny, as it became known, arguably represented the most severe outbreak of indiscipline in any British and Commonwealth force in both World Wars. This incident created great bitterness towards Fraser and the Labour government. As the election drew closer, Fraser's government's popularity was beginning to wane. Sid Holland remained leader of the National Party and had managed to overcome the internal problems which had once troubled the party, and now presented a credible threat to Labour. Holland was proving to be an effective leader, while the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, was weary and in poor health. The after effects of the war, including ongoing shortages, were affecting the government's popularity. Parliament would be dissolved in October 1946 by the newly appointed Governor-General and war hero Sir Bernard Freyberg. Just before the election, the Labour Party would do something they had wanted to do for a long, long time: abolishing the country quota. The Electoral Amendment Act would pass and would change the electoral distributions based on the 1945 census. The bill proposed the complete abolition of the country quota and that electorates be based on adult as opposed to total population, and it reduced the number and increased the size of rural electorates. None of the existing electorates remained unchanged. 26 electorates were abolished, 19 electorates were created for the first time, and 6 former electorates were re-established. The 1946 electoral redistribution had to take in 10 years of population growth and movements into account. The North Island gained a further 2 electorates from the South Island due to faster population growth. The Nats and those in rural communities criticised this act, arguing that Labour were trying to silence the voices of those in rural communities by diminishing their presence in Parliament. The campaign was fiercely fought as Labour campaigned on its record and warned voters that National would undo the progress and policies that Labour had achieved. National heavily attacked Labour for continued rationing and the shortages, and argued Labour was suffocating economic growth with their policies. And the winner was Peter Fraser and Labour with 42 seats, down 3 from the last election and 51% of the vote, up 3% from the last election. While Labour had comfortably won the popular vote, they would now only retain office by a 4-seat margin. Not far behind Labour was Sid Holland and National with 38 seats, up 4 and 48% of the vote, up 5%. This election was a straight fight between Labour and National, as no independents were elected and candidates who were not from either of those two parties only won 0.3% of the vote. Interesting, this election showed the importance of the Māori seats. As in the general electorates, National and Labour would tie with 38 seats each. However, Labour would win all 4 Māori seats, giving them a majority. This victory became known as the Māori Mandate, and it seemed Labour would now have to deliver for Māori if they had any hope of winning the next election. 93.5% of eligible voters would turn out for this election and would be the highest ever voter turnout up until that point. Thanks for watching and come back next time.